Hello, I'm Mariam Mashiri, and this is the Iran War Today, our daily briefing bringing you up to date with all you need to know on day 68 of the US-Israel war with Iran. Well, let's start with some of today's key developments. Iranian officials review a new US proposal to end the war. Meanwhile, Donald Trump threatens the most intense strikes yet if a deal isn't reached. We'll head to Washington and speak to our correspondent who's been at the White House assessing the details of claims and counterclaims of a possible deal. Global oil prices have dipped below $100 per barrel following those reports of a possible agreement. Our deputy economics editor, Darshini David, will break down what impact this could have on inflation and jet fuel supplies. And in the last 24 hours, we've had rumours of a deal that would loosen Tehran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz. The US is saying it would pause its operation to guide ships through the strait. Our world affairs correspondent will give us the big picture of where we are in the conflict. Let's begin now in Iran, where the regime in Tehran says it's still considering a new US proposal to end the war. President Trump has issued an ultimatum to Iran, telling them to accept the deal and reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face intense renewed US bombing. Well, first, let's cross to the region and speak to our correspondent, Carrie Davies, who's in Dubai. Carrie, the first question, what is Tehran saying about the current standoff?
Well, of course, the initial sound, the fact that Iran has acknowledged that they are looking at this proposal, does sound positive. But let's hear some of the other things that we've started to hear as well from Iran, too. We heard from one spokesperson who said that Iran will deliver a harsh and regret-inducing response. That they've also said that Iran would not be obtaining through a failed war what they failed to gain in face-to-face negotiations. Talking about as well, some Iranian spokespeople talking about this being a wish list rather than reality, and also discussions about Iran having its finger on the trigger too, which is not dissimilar to the sort of language we've heard from President Trump saying that if Iran does not agree to some form of deal, that there will be some form of further bombing, that would be even more severe, President Trump said, than previously. So both sides talking tough in this situation. But of course what we don't know because we can't see what's going on behind closed doors, is how much the two sides have any form of common ground. Are they genuinely making some form of movement? Are they finding some sort of commonality that could lead to some form of recognition or a deal? That is really difficult to know. So on one side, we're hearing some form of positive noises from both sides. We're also hearing tough talk too.
And of course, Pakistani sources seem to be suggesting to some media outlets that a deal could be in the offing. So how should we read that, Carrie? Is it credible?
I think it's really difficult to know exactly what that necessarily means, and that is partly because we've had some of these anonymous sourcing from Pakistan before. I would also just premise this by saying that there was a lot of scepticism that Pakistan would be able to pull off the first round of talks. Again, a lot of anonymous sourcing suggesting behind the scenes, the people I was speaking to were saying that they felt confident that they would. And despite that scepticism, that first round of talks did happen. The most senior delegation from the US and from the Iranian side to meet in person since 1979. So to some extent, that means that a lot of the sort of credibility has been regained by a lot of those Pakistani sources who were really saying this could genuinely happen. However, the fact that that second round of talks didn't occur also means that it's really difficult to know exactly whether or not there was a lot of talking up of those talks for that second round, and ultimately they didn't yet materialise. So it's really hard to know whether or not a lot of the room is being read correctly. And of course, Pakistan really wants these negotiations to happen. They want to have serious talks, and ideally they want to see this sort of all resolved too. And they have been really active in that and been acting in promoting themselves as being the mediators on this world stage too. So whether or not Pakistan can be viewed as knowing definitely what Iran is going to be doing next, whether this is really tangible and very close to the table, they might be able to know. We just don't know until we finally get both sides coming out with something a bit more concrete. At the moment, there's a lot of whispers behind closed doors, behind this diplomatic curtain. and it's really hard to know which direction it's going to go.
OK, yep. Carrie, thank you very much indeed. Well, the status of the Hormuz Strait and whether it's open to shipping or not has presented a disorientating picture in the last few days. So let's remind you. President Trump announced Project Freedom on Sunday, arguing it was a humanitarian gesture to help seafarers stuck in the Gulf. On Monday, Iran claimed a US warship had been hit by 2 missiles, while the US said it had attacked 7 Iranian fast boats. Both sides rejected these claims. Well, on Tuesday, the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed 2 commercial ships had passed through, showing the lane is clear and Iran is embarrassed, in his words. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, told reporters the initial US-Israeli offensive in Iran was over, with all its objectives achieved. Then, hours later, the US president announced the initiative would pause for a short period of time to see whether the US and Iran can come to an agreement. Well, Donald Trump's announcement that Project Freedom was being put on hold yesterday caught many by surprise, particularly after top officials spent the day discussing the plan and its goals. Well, let's cross to DC and speak to our correspondent, Bernd de Boosman. Bernd, difficult decisions on what to accept or not to accept from Iran in terms of making a deal, and confusing as well for people watching this from the outside.
It has very confusing, and as you mentioned, it's been 24 hours full of various twists and turns. For now, however, President Trump still seems at the very least cautiously optimistic about the prospects of a deal. In the last half hour or so, he was addressing a gathering of military mothers at the White House. He said he still feels quite confident that Iran will come to a deal, but at the same time, he, again, as he did on Truth Social this morning, suggested that Iran could also be coerced into a deal. He said that they'll come to a deal one way or another, kind of subtly suggesting that the possibility of further strikes remains on the table. And experts I've spoken to here in Washington over the last few hours, they also caution what this deal entails. The one-page memorandum that's been reported in various news outlets at best could amount to kicking the can down the road. Some of the issues at hand, particularly the issue of Iran's uranium stocks that President Trump wants to take possession of. Those are enormously technical details. In the Obama administration, for example, it took 20 months to kind of iron out the details about the future of Iran's nuclear program. So I think he's cautiously optimistic, but at the same time, many people here see this essentially as a deal to continue talking about a deal, kind of opening the pathway to a more detailed agreement rather than kind of a deal that would end this war once and for all.
Bernd, thank you very much. Well, today, global oil prices dipped below $100 per barrel following reports of that possible deal. But figures show 13,000 flights have been cancelled globally this month alone after the war caused jet fuel prices to soar. With more, here's our Deputy Economics Editor, Darshini David.
Several hurdles remain, but this is the closest the US and Iran have got to an agreement. It's been another quiet day in the Strait of Hormuz, but could a plan to get traffic moving be looming? Well, earlier the oil price dipped to below $100 per barrel, but that remained more than 40% above where we were ahead of the war, because after all those previous twists, investors are cautious. And even with a swift resolution, the impact of this is being felt widely. Take travel. Airlines have cancelled 13,000 flights globally in May. That's 2 million seats. Turkish, Emirates, Lufthansa, among those cancelling, but these amount to just 1% of global flights, and some may reflect contingency planning, cutting back in a relatively quiet month to ensure there's fuel for the peak summer season. Here in the UK, however, airlines say they're largely operating as normal. But fares are going up. These are some of the airlines that have already hiked their prices. Some are more than 50% higher than last year. Jet fuel accounts for more than a quarter of airlines' costs. That's more than doubled. And there's only so much they'd stocked up in advance. Tonight, the government is urging people not to change travel plans. EasyJet says customers can book with confidence, but the horizon is unclear. A smooth ride in the skies this summer may depend on what happens on the ground and in that narrow waterway in the Middle East.
So where does this all leave us now? Well, it appears both the White House and the regime in Tehran are in some kind of standoff. Both sides know a return to conflict is not what they want. So, who blinks first? Well, let's speak to our world affairs correspondent, Paul Adams. And Paul, 24 hours ago, both sides were literally exchanging fire in Hormuz, apparently. Now we're talking about peace talks being resolved. So what's your assessment of where we are right now?
Look, I think we're still in a very fragile state. In fact, I think there were reports that US forces were once again interdicting an Iranian vessel today and using force in the process. So, there's plenty of potential still for this to flare up. But I think you're absolutely right. The two sides do not really want to go back to war. And I think the Americans in particular don't want to go back to all-out war. Project Freedom, which was introduced just on Monday, was a bit of a last throw of the dice, the sort of theory that somehow the Americans could maintain their own blockade while puncturing the Iranian blockade. Well, they did that, and they only got 2 vessels through. But in the process of that, they prompted the Iranians to respond with attacks both at sea and also, crucially, against oil facilities in the United Arab Emirates. So I think the consequences of continuing with Project Freedom were deemed to be simply too risky. In the background, while all of that was going on, we now know that there were all sorts of messages flying this way and that, with Pakistan still very keen to be seen as a key mediator here. Perhaps the Chinese also playing a role. Bear in mind that the Iranian foreign minister has been in Beijing, and Donald Trump, of course, is going to Beijing for a very, very important meeting with President Xi next week. And so all of that has been going on. And at the moment, we seem to be in a situation in which the latest version of this memorandum, which Bernd was just describing, is out there. Everyone is taking a look at it. We don't know what is in it, and we certainly don't know if the two sides are going to agree to pursue it. But it does seem to be some kind of blueprint which would allow the end of hostilities, a gradual end of hostilities, the gradual opening of the Strait of Hormuz, and then setting the scene for the really difficult negotiations on things like Iran's nuclear program.
I mean, it almost feels, doesn't it, like both sides have just come to the conclusion that they just don't want this to carry on anymore, rather than one side necessarily blinking first.
Yes, look, all that confidence that we heard from President Trump at the beginning of this, back at the end of February, and that we still hear from time to time from Pete Hegseth and actually from Donald Trump himself, it's really kind of gone because, a war launched originally to definitively remove all prospect of Iran getting a nuclear weapon is now probably going to result in a deal to resolve a problem that never existed in the first place, and that is the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. If that can be resolved to the satisfaction of both sides, and that is a big if, because the Iranians are in the process of implementing a whole new regime for the Strait of Hormuz, and it's not clear whether they're prepared to walk away from that. The whole question of Iran's nuclear program has sort of receded. The Americans cannot be seen to abandon that issue, and whatever memorandum emerges, it, from an American point of view, it has to have that front and center with the prospect of negotiations soon to address that complicated issue and to deal with it in a way that Donald Trump can sell as an improvement on the previous nuclear deal negotiated under Donald Trump. But the fact of the matter is that an issue which Donald Trump thought he was going to resolve along with Israel through the exclusive use of blunt force is now going to have to be resolved, is perhaps being resolved by diplomacy.
OK, Paul, thank you very much indeed. Paul Adams. Well, whether you're joining us on YouTube, TikTok, Sounds, radio or television, thanks for your time. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with the Iran War Today.